Thank you everyone for joining this afternoon, evening for the first installation of our Money Matters conversations about certain topics revolving finance that I think are very important for our founders, our community, people who will be applying for financing, and all entrepreneurs who are managing a growing business, raising capital, and all of the rest. To give you a sense of how we're going to do this today, I have a few slides prepared to go through some high-level items. I then have a financial model to hop through at a very high level to help validate some of the things that I'll be discussing. And then I hope that people during the conversation will submit their questions. We have a question and answer session near the end. And so I will try to collect and answer the questions in the best way that I can in the last, call it 15 to 20 minutes, depending on how the flow goes. And then questions that are not answered during this session will likely be summarized or handled on a one-off basis. So I highly encourage people to ask their questions. And of course, our goal will not be to teach an MBA course in an hour, but to absolutely provide some high-level understanding for people who have chosen to attend. So let's talk numbers. Today we'll go through Finance 101 for founders. My name is Elliott Holland. I am a principal at Collab Capital. My background has been around small business, finance, acquisition, due diligence for over 10 years. And so what I'll try to do today is sort of convey as much as I can to people in a way that they can consume. Again, the objectives for today, the first piece is just overall Finance 101. So your numbers tell the story for your business, and you're going to need investors to grow. And so you need to be able to have conversations with investors about your financials. And that's why we're going into this anyway. A lot of people here will be excellent coders, excellent general managers, excellent fundraisers, whatever the case may be. But some basic understanding of finance will help you expand those skills to help optimize how you run your business. Your numbers also help you know how long you can operate before you run out of cash. So one of the conundrums of a startup is that you are not fully funded. You have to get funding as you grow. And if you run out of funding, you have to either let go of things and cut, or go out of business, or go get a job. And so it's very important, even if you're not a finance specialist, to understand how the numbers give you a sense on what your burn rate, runway, and those kind of things are. And we'll get into those later. And then your vision for your business will manifest itself in your numbers. So if you want to be the greatest technology business the world has ever seen, but you have one customer today, you still need to paint that picture for people through numbers. The second piece, and arguably more important for this audience, is just removing the stigma. So too many founders in general, but particularly Black founders, we weren't taught finance in our homes. We weren't taught it too well in our schools. We have said things like we may not be good at finance. And so now you're a business operator that needs to know it. And there's a stigma around not knowing it and it being acceptable. And we're trying to kind of shake that and just see if there's a better way to handle it. And then a lot of finance is just understanding patterns. So one of the things we're going to go through today is that the majority of finance here in the United States and really worldwide is based on 3 key financial statements. And we're going to go through those. And once you start understanding the patterns in those, a lot of other things become way easier. And then the third pillar is just to support better business. So understanding and owning your financials will make you a better business operator, and that'll make you a better fundraiser. And then it's hard to evaluate different business options without any ability to put them into an array or a spreadsheet or something to understand, well, to do these two, I'm going to need this much money. I don't have it, so I can only do one. but alternatively, I could do these 10 things, but that will prevent me from doing this other. And so understanding the mathematics behind your options is important. Moving along, the agenda today, first will be sort of how founders use finance. Then we'll hop into the 3 statements. I mentioned that before: the income statement, the balance sheet, the cash flow statement. Then we'll talk a little bit about runway and burn rate. And then my favorite, how does any of this help you make decisions? Because hopefully that's why you're here. So the rest of this will be really to help us get to this piece. And in this part near the end, hopefully I'll have time to hop into a sample financial model. Let me see here. All right. So move this down to the bottom. The first statement, and one you probably know the most, is the income statement. And the way I would encourage you to think about the income statement is like it's really like a funnel. And too often we get super caught up into revenue, but revenue is only a piece of this funnel. So when you think about the income statement, the way it's set up is revenue minus cost of goods sold minus operating expenses equals your profit. So revenue is all the money all your customers pay you for all the products and services you render to them. Cost of goods sold are all the direct expenses associated with producing those products or services. So if you're in a manufacturing facility, all of the lights, the energy, the labor associated with screwing things in, those are all cost of goods sold. For a technology company, cost of goods sold is smaller. It's the direct technology expenses and the direct labor needed to actually run the technology on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So all of the direct costs associated with delivering the product or service are in cost of goods sold. There may be 5 lines of cost of goods sold, there may be 1, but they're all the direct costs associated with generating the revenue. Next is operating expenses. And really this is a catch-all. So all of the other expenses that are not cost of goods sold are generally looped into operating expenses. Now, sometimes you'll see SG&A, selling, general, and administrative. But for startup businesses, I didn't think it made sense to go into the difference in between SG&A and other operating expenses. All of this is looped into operating expenses, and it's salaries, it's overhead, it's sales, it's rent, it's all these other things that you need to pay to keep the business going. And then once you take in the revenue, you pay your cost of goods sold, you pay your operating expenses, what you're left with is profit. And profit is the cash that allows you to feel happy about what you've done. The sort of end all be all goal for a lot of business owners is to maximize profit. And even if you're in a business that's going to take a lot of time operating at a loss before you're able to turn a profit, you're still thinking about your vision is getting to a profitable business. And that's the way you should think about it. The other thing is each dollar that you spend in cost of goods sold or operating expenses, you don't get to keep in profit. And that's why a lot of owners are very, very, very prudent about how they spend. And also why in a startup environment, there's trade-offs between getting there quickly and getting there conservatively, managing your cash. And I think we're all managing it between those two ends of the spectrum. Now, one of the things that frustrated me the most about finance, I actually started my career in engineering. And so some words have 5 to 10 different permutations. And so if you don't know what they are, it can be confusing. So profit is sort of the umbrella term, but other terms that mean about the same: EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes. You probably heard of EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. You've heard of operating income. It's the same thing as EBIT. And if it's a public company, they'll talk about earnings, which is slightly different, but effectively a measure of profit. So the first statement to understand is your income statement. The next statement is the balance sheet. And so if the income statement is a analysis of a funnel, so revenue minus cost equals profit, the balance sheet is a snapshot of the different accounts that you have in your business. So it is your cash balance, all the assets you own, how much debt you owe, how much you owe your employees. And so that's the way that it's set up. So if you look at an income statement, it'll be for a period. So like the year 2020, whereas your balance sheet will be for a day. And to be specific, the end of the day. So it's a snapshot at 5 p.m. of that day. The balance sheet is set up in the following way. The top, your current assets. These are assets that could be turned to cash in less than a year. Those are things like accounts receivable. So you do a service for your client pays you in 30 days. Between when you deliver the service and they pay you, it's called an accounts receivable. That's going to turn to cash in less than a year. So that's a current asset. Your inventory, you have a product business. You have 100 widgets in a warehouse somewhere. Those widgets will more than likely turn into cash within 1 year. And so those are called current assets. The next are long-term assets. So you've built a big technology platform. You put $500,000 into that technology platform. If you were to sell that technology platform, you would not be able to likely sell it within a year. And so that's a long-term asset. And a more of a manufacturing concept, or for instance, one of our companies has a rental component. The assets that are for rent are not likely going to be sold in a year. So those are long-term assets. You add those up and you get to your total assets. When you think about liabilities, it's very similar. So your current liabilities are amounts of money that you're going to likely pay out within a year. So you pay your employees every 2 weeks, but 1 week into that 2-week period, you owe them 1 week of payroll. That will show up in your current liabilities as a account payable. You take stuff from your vendors and pay them in 30 days. That's an account payable, money you owe that will become due within a year. Even the amount of money you're going to owe your bank inside of this year is a current liability. Then there's long-term liabilities, which are liabilities that will not become due within the current year. So a convertible note is actually an off-balance sheet liability. But if you take on 3-year debt, that debt's not going to get paid inside of this year. That's a long-term liability. There's various other examples, but for most people, it'll be some form of debt. It'll be a long-term liability. And then the classic equations that help you understand a balance sheet and why it's called that is because assets equals liability plus equity, or the easier way to look at it is assets minus liabilities equals equity. So if you have $1 million worth of assets, $800,000 worth of liabilities, you have $200,000 of equity. And so you can get into a lot of finite line items about what each and everything means, or you can just think about it at a high level. Your assets minus your liabilities equals your equity. So I'm going to take a second here and see. I don't have any questions yet, but I'm still kind of early into this, so it'll get more interactive in a second. The next piece is the cash flow statement. I see a couple of questions. I'm going to hop in here and see if we can. For a startup that is pre-revenue, is it better to show a multi-year balance sheet to tell the story of how initial capital has been used? Oh, thank you, Lavanya. Erica, let me hop into this. So the balance sheet isn't the best tool to show somebody how the investment was used. If you're pre-revenue, you still want to use the income statement, which will show the money that you spent in each period that you spent it. You'll want to also show the balance sheet to just show how much cash you have left and how much you have in terms of liabilities. And we'll get into burn rate and runway here in a second. And it's not that much different if you're pre-revenue if you're post-revenue but pre-profit, or you're post-profit, these are sort of the statements that you'll use to convey your business to investors unilaterally. So you may spend more time on one statement than the other, but typically a lot of time is spent on the income statement. It actually tells you the most about your operations. Subject to, in startups and in operating businesses too, the balance sheet shows you a lot about how much cash a business has left, which tells you a lot about how long they can operate in steady state without a disruption. All right, let's go to the cash flow statement. Guys, please don't be shy. The questions do help break this up. So think of the cash flow statement as reconciling the income statement and the balance sheet, okay? So it really helps answer the question, like, what cash do I have in my hands, right? In another conversation we have this month, I'll talk about why you can't spend profit, you can only spend cash. But just for now, let's just recognize that those two things are different. And this sheet reconciles the two. I will hop into in a second what are the three pieces of the statement: the operating cash flows, the investing cash flows, and the financing cash flows. And I'll always want to make sure that everyone's rooted in, for startups, cash flow is related to burn rate. So if you have $100 of cash and you're burning through $50 a month, you have 2 months before you're going to need to raise capital or shut down. And so the cash flow statement has a great ability to show you that. Now let me hop into what these different areas are. So operating cash flows. So the cash flow statement starts off with net income from the income statement. So 2 slides ago, we talked about the income statement. And when you get down to the bottom of it, you get to profit. Well, net income is one of the names of profit. And so you start with net income. Then you make adjustments for things that help reconcile net income to cash. So I mentioned accounts receivable. Those are goods or services you provided to customers that have not paid you yet. Since they have not paid you, you have to adjust that out because it's not cash yet. For accounts payable, that's work that people have done for you that you haven't paid them for. And so you kept the cash. And even though your income statement will show that reduction, you haven't paid the cash out. So you have to adjust for that. In asset-heavy businesses, there's depreciation. And depreciation is a tax construct, not really a true expense. You don't pay depreciation to anyone. And so you net that out or adjust for that. And once you do all of that, you have your operating cash flows. The operating cash flows tell the cash that a business creates or uses during its operations. So that's why it's called that. Investing cash flows, that's the next section. So those are things like capital expenditures. You spend $500,000 on a long-term technology platform. Capital expenditures, you buy the building you're operating out of to lower your rent or give yourself the ability to see the equity appreciation in the building. There's a bunch of other things that can be added in there. So for instance, if you're a rental company, you buy a new asset to rent, that's a capital expenditure. If you're a trucking company, you buy a new truck. All those things are investing cash flows. That's you, and it tells how much you've invested in the business, what you invested in, and how the investment amounts have varied over time. The next piece is financing cash flows. So financing is any kind of debt or equity financing that you've either taken on or paid off. So new loans, paying off old loans, new equity financings, all of that shows up in financing cash flows. And when you add your operating to your investing to your financing, that's when you get your total cash flow. And that's actually the money you can spend. I will get into that more in a subsequent conversation, but just know the reason the cash flow statement is sometimes the most useful, but also sometimes the least often used, is because you can get a lot of numbers that are close to the cash flow on the income statement. And so people tend to spend their time there. But true investors, and even if you're having an issue understanding your income statement, you may want to talk to your CPA about, hey, can you walk me through my cash flow statement? And that'll help you understand in what areas are you spending your money. For instance, you may be doing work for clients, and because your clients are huge, they're paying you in 90 days, but you have to pay your employees every 2 weeks. Well, in that case, your net income up at the top would look great. But because you'd have to adjust for AR and AP, the cash that would come out of your operations would be low because you're essentially giving credit to these big customers that you have that aren't paying you for 90 days. And it'll help you understand that in the way that you manage your business. I'm going to hop into QA. Can a purchase fall under both financing and investing cash flows? I'm going to answer that. It's a great question. Yeah, so I'll answer both questions. So can a purchase show up in investing cash flows and financing? Yes, but think about it as your person. You buy a car, right? So you bought a car, you invested in yourself or in your household of a car. So one car, call it $10,000, right? To get that car, you took out a loan. Let's just call it for $10,000 to make it simple. The loan will show up under financing cash flows. The asset you purchased will show up under investing cash flows. Now, gosh, Elliott, that's confusing. Why do they do it that way? The reason it's done that way is just because the question that investors ask is oftentimes different around how you've invested in your business and how you financed it. So as a startup company, it's going to be way easier to raise equity than debt. But as a steady state company, you'd be more easily able to raise debt. And so if somebody just looked at your financing cash flows as all equity, they might think that, oh my gosh, they're underutilizing debt. But when they see that how much you're investing in your business, they'll be able to understand, okay, this person is properly investing in their business. They're doing a good job. And as you spend more time with these statements, you'll understand them more. The other statement I saw about, oh my gosh, my profit and loss statement will be in the red. We are in the land of profit and loss statements being in the red. So we've invested in over 10 companies here at Collab. A lot of those companies are still in the red. If you look at some of the biggest blockbuster Silicon Valley businesses, they were in the red for 10 plus years. I think people get in more trouble hiding numbers from sophisticated investors than just telling it like it is. Now, sometimes telling it like it is a little painful. And I've started several businesses and I've been in those conversations, and when it's all red, it's a pain in the butt. The only time I felt worse than that is when I was talking to someone. I tried to hide what was really happening. I had a full half-hour conversation with them. They didn't know I needed help because I tried to make it look like it was great. And after the conversation, I got no help from this person, only to find out later at a different meeting or meeting them in a different life, they could have helped with that problem. Maybe not in their own firm or out of their own pocketbook, but in some sort of resource that they had access to. And I wasn't honest, and so I missed the opportunity. Let me see what else we have here. I'll answer this in a second. Oh, this is a great question, Andrea. So for most people on this call, it's better to run your business off of cash flow. Why? It's sort of very similar to profit, and it's the lifeblood of how you'll stay in business. So once you run out of cash, you have to go get a job or something else, right? So as long as you're managing your business for cash flow, you always have the opportunity to fight another day. If you manage your business for tax benefit, two ways to think about that, and I won't get too deep into this. Some people run lifestyle businesses, and those are businesses that kind of rich dad, poor dad, they run a lot of personal expenses through. Those are going to be very hard to get financed because there's a lot of personal expenses ran through them, but they will shield people from taxes if they so choose to do that. If you run a typical startup for tax benefit, it doesn't make a lot of sense because you're not going to have most times enough taxable income to incur any tax in the business. So you running it for tax benefit when the tax burden is zero isn't the most sort of efficient way to do it. Let me see if hopefully I answered that okay. And I'll talk about burn rate in a second because it's on one of the following slides. So we talked through cash flow. Now, runway and cash burn. And this is where I'm gonna ask you guys to be interactive. These questions are not that hard, so please don't be shy. So let's just introduce the terms. So burn rate is how quickly you're burning through your cash. Runway is how many months or weeks of operation do you have before you run out of money. So they're kind of inversely related, okay? So, and I'll talk about some hacks and some traps. And I'll also kind of tell you about where you should be looking for these things. So you get your cash burn from your income statement. And sometimes from your cash flow statement, but for 95% of the people here, it'll be from your income statement. You get your cash amount from your balance sheet. And so therefore, you take the cash on your balance sheet, you divide it by your burn, and that's your runway. So let's use an example. Let's say you have $100,000 in the bank and your salary is $10,000 a month. Your developer salary is $10,000 a month, and you spend $5,000 a month on advertising. What is your monthly cash burns? I'm looking for folks to pop this into the chat or the Q&A. Whoa, first two, boom. So this concept isn't all that complicated. You just have to know what numbers to put in. So Jacqueline, you're absolutely right. Your cash burn is $25,000 a month, right? As a result, $100,000, the cash you have available, divided by your burn rate is your runway. So you have 4 months of operation before you're going to be out of cash. You need to either get more dollars in investment or cut down on your expenses so you actually have more runway to operate your business. It's also not healthy to operate for very long periods of time, very close to being out of cash. You just have to make some very difficult decisions. Now, you don't always have the choice, but it's not the best way to operate. So that's why some of this financial stuff is really important, even for someone who's not a financial expert or who did not study it. But hey, that wasn't hard. The first two people got it right. So let me talk about some runway hacks and traps. So, and we've seen this quite a bit in our portfolio. Imagine a fee that is taken out of your earnings as opposed to you paying it up front. How does that affect your cash burn? Well, if I think about a single month, and let's think about an ad spend that I have to pay before the month, or an advertising platform where I can pay 20% of my revenue, or I'm paying a platform fee. Well, it's way harder to pay the money up front to then get a return during the month than to be able to operate the business, take in revenue and pay 20% or pay a fee out of the revenue. If you're able to pay a fee out of the revenue you create, that's a runway hack, because you can almost forget about that expense because you don't have to incur it until after revenue comes in. So it's not perfect, but for a lot of businesses, you are able to pay some of your expenses out of cash or revenue you're going to generate. And so therefore you can think about them differently versus if you need to pay the $5,000 at the beginning of the month to get the revenue, then that has to come straight out of cash. One of the traps. So one of the things that some companies will encounter if they have to buy inventory or if they have to sort of repeatedly buy assets, so cars or trucks, whatever the case may be, is that your burn rate may be $25,000, but you need to spend another $10,000 on inventory that you exhausted by running the business for that month. And so in that case, you need to not only think about your burn rate from an income statement perspective, but how much cash do you normally on a monthly basis need to spend on inventory purchases. And so for inventory-based businesses, they have sort of two major components to their burn rate that they have to consider and optimize separately. And so that's a trap, is that some people will think about the burn rate just as their salary and advertising spend and other income statement items and forget about inventory or capital expenditures. All those things have to come out of cash. Let's see, do I have any more questions? Okay, we talked about burn rate. Have I ever seen a startup recover from zero cash burn over 6 months, or when should a founder call it quits? I'm assuming you mean zero cash flow, but that might mean zero cash burn too, because you're not paying yourself. Absolutely. So this isn't really the forum to talk about when should a founder call it quits. I think that's very much a function and a decision that each person has to make based on their own financial wherewithal, their next best option, how quickly they can get another job, heck, how rich their parents, friends, or their spouse is, right? What I can say is I've seen businesses do nothing for 6 months and skyrocket. I've seen companies skyrocket and then fall. And so you're never really out of it. And sometimes the best thing to do is to reel your expenses in to give yourself more runway. And that can be tough to do in a startup environment where everybody talks so much about growth and revenue that they forget about you can grow yourself into insolvency, or you can grow yourself into bankruptcy by not managing your cash flow appropriately. So I want to spend some time in decision-making based on these different statements, because like I said at the beginning, all of this analysis, and the only reason why you should be listening to me at all is if you thought that all of this stuff could help you make decisions in your business, either now or in the future. So let's talk about that. And I'll break it up into income statement decisions, balance sheet, and cash flow / burn rate decisions, because they're kind of similar. So the income statement will help you understand if you want to stay profitable, when can you hire a new developer? It'll also tell you, hey, investor wants to know, well, how quickly can you get to $1 million in revenue? Your income statement with the projection will help you get that answer. Also, what is your burn rate, which has inverse effects on your runway, will come primarily on your income statement. We just talked about inventory and other things being sometimes part of burn rate, but for a lot of technology businesses, that's negligible. Let's talk about balance sheet decisions. So how much runway do you have? That's a function of how much cash you have. The cash is shown on the balance sheet. And so it'll tell you not only when will you run out of cash, but maybe 2 months ahead of running out of cash, or 6 months, whatever the number is. You need to be fairly confident that you can raise some more capital or prepare to deal with the consequences of that. Also, how much debt do you have? You may get a valuation on your business of $1 million. That's great, but if you have $1.5 million of debt, it's not the same as if you have $0 of debt. And so how much debt you have, and not only how much debt do you have, but will you be able to loan or borrow more money? Those things will also sort of be enabled, or sort of, you'll shine a light on that looking at your balance sheet. Cash flow decisions. So I talked earlier about you may have a decent profit, but it's not making it into your bank account. That may be because you're extending terms to your customers, or you may be paying your vendors and employees too quickly. And so a decent sized profit number can get soaked up by poor sort of cash flow management decisions in the business. And then as a result, you may say, hey, if I can extend my payment terms 30 days with my clients, will that be a competitive advantage? And to look to see if you can actually do that, should do that, the implications of doing that, those things would be in your cash flow statement. Let me also take a moment to say all of this may be over your head. Elliott, you lost me 5 minutes in. That's okay. Another good outcome of this presentation is just to know if you're in over your head in this, go get help. That doesn't mean hire a CFO. That doesn't mean go spend a bunch of money on some fancy model. It may just mean go find a service or a CPA that can get your numbers in order for one time and not a monthly situation, or go find a software like a Bench or a Zero. And we'll talk about quick hacks to get your financials in order to go talk to a venture capitalist in a subsequent workshop. But even if this stuff is sort of completely over your head, and for years it was completely over mine, because it's so important, when you start getting serious, you should really either know it yourself or find someone to help you with it. So now what I'd like to do is, we have about just under 20 minutes left. I can pop into an example financial model, Dollar Cave Club, or I can answer more questions for another 5 minutes, and then hop into the model, or anything that people so choose. So like most meetings, the last end of the agenda will be governed by who's here. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And if not, in a minute or two, I will hop into an example financial model. Let's see. So can we choose which expenses to add into your burn rate? You can't choose. It sort of is what it is. So if you start the month off with $100, and at the end of the month you have 50, I don't care what your 3 financial statements are, your burn rate was $50. That's how much you spent in that month. Now, to categorize it appropriately over longer periods of time, should you average it over multiple periods? Sure. But you're not able to choose which numbers are in or out of your burn rate. You may say, hey, my true expenses are X, but I have to spend so much on inventory. That's why X plus Y is my burn rate, to communicate the different pieces separately. But it doesn't make sense to sort of try to exclude things that are included or include things that aren't. It just doesn't really get you anywhere. At the end of the day, when you run out of cash, everyone will know that your burn rate was higher than you said it was. And that'll have implications both for your business, but for your credibility. Thank you. Best software to use for startups like QuickBooks, etc. Eric, that's tough. I think QuickBooks is a great solution for many people. I think 10 years ago, I would have said QuickBooks almost without equivocation. Today, there are lots of other softwares that are good. FreshBooks. I think Quicken has a software. There's a bunch of others that are on the market. What I would say is the software that's best for you is the one that's easiest for you to understand based on how much you're willing to spend. And so what I did in my times when I've managed my own financials for businesses and even in businesses that I'm operating in now, you might try 3 or 2 or get referrals from your friends. The one that's best is the one that sort of speaks to you the easiest or is the most efficient for you. I would also consider asking other people that are in your industry what system they're using. Oftentimes, certain financial softwares are better for certain industries, and some of those realities will sort of carry over from one industry to another. I think I have one more. No big deal. Again, this is one of 4 parts. So in future parts, we're going to get into forecasting, aka predicting the future. We're going to get into quick hacks on how to get your financials in order for a venture capital meeting. We're going to talk about revenue recognition. and a lot of other things that I don't want to get into here because I won't have the time to explain them fully enough, where I think I won't cause more questions than I'll answer questions. So if you stay with us for the rest of the month, I think you'll get a way more robust understanding of those things. Yes, I will share the model. I was able to find it online, so it's not proprietary. Okay, so now we have about 15 minutes left. I will hop into a financial model to give an example of how some of this is set up traditionally. Now, this is for one type of business. It won't fit your business perfectly, but I think once you show someone what's in something, it's best to just hop right in it and talk through it. And then I would ask you guys to continue to pop questions in. I'll try to save a couple of minutes at the end to go through questions. And if I'm able to go over for a few minutes, I will do that as well. So I talked about monthly subscription price, churn. These are all metrics that you will know about your business. So when you start putting together any set of financials, or even if you want to talk about your business, you should know sort of these things. The next piece is unit economics. I won't spend a lot of time on this call about this, but essentially what unit economics are is understanding how profitable a single product or a single iteration of your service, how profitable it is. And those are two important things when you're thinking about your projection models. And we'll spend more time on that in a future installment. Now let's talk about the income statement. So I talked about revenue being at the top. So in this case, subscription revenue, add-ons, e-commerce, advertising, all adds up to gross or total revenue. Now I told you direct costs are called what's cost of goods sold. So your internet infrastructure costs, your subscription costs, if you have to pay money to keep those subscribers, e-commerce costs. So now your total costs are 233 in this case. They could be whatever they are. So now your gross profit is $98,000 in this case. Now you have your operating expenses that I talked about earlier, your marketing costs. And this is just gross profit after sales and marketing, which for sales and marketing heavy companies, you should calculate this. But now you have a lot of indirect costs. So salaries, rent, technology, legal and accounting, travel, training, recruiting. These are your total indirect costs. So now you started with 332 at the top of the funnel. You spent 233 on direct costs. You have a gross profit of 98,000. You spent 162 on marketing and advertising. You're at negative 64,000. You spent another big amount on indirect costs, and now you're at negative 833. Maybe you're 1% of that, so negative 8,000. Maybe you're 10% of that, negative 83,000. Maybe you're profitable, and so now your $4 million of revenue minus your 2.9, minus your minus your 240, minus your 1 million, you're $166,000 in the black. Whatever the case may be, what I want you to notice is the way that those income statements are set up, the buckets are essentially the same. Now let's go into your balance sheet. Let me blow this up. Very simple balance sheet. So I told you current assets are at the top. So cash will convert in a year. Accounts receivable will convert in a year. Inventory will likely convert in a year. This business won't have much in terms of fixed assets, so therefore not much in terms of depreciation. So your total assets are $257,000 at the end of the year 2019. Remember, I told you balance sheets are like snapshots, whereas income statements talk about a whole period. So even though this says 2019, this is just December 31st, 2019 at close of business. Now let's go into liabilities. This business had accounts payable or money they owed people of $90,000, short-term debt let's say you need $20,000 from someone to do something. Long-term debt, that's your long-term liability. So if you take a 3-year loan from Bank of America, that would show up here. In this case, all they had was accounts payable, money they owed to people. So primarily accounts payable is money you owe to vendors and employees. So $90,000 worth of total liabilities. And so I said on the slide, your assets minus your liabilities equal your equity. So here, $257,000 worth of assets minus $90,000 of liabilities equal $166,000 worth of equity. The reason why I give you the high level equations is in small businesses, these two things are really tricky to calculate, and I won't even get into it today. But what you know is if you know your assets and you know what you owe people, then you know what the equity value is in your business. And so at a high level, start there and then dig into these individual areas as you get more advanced. And then cash flow. Admittedly, this is likely the least used financial statement. The reason I bring it up is because no conversation of financials would be complete without the third statement. So financials in the United States, and like I said, across the globe, are 3-statement financial systems. They're income statement, balance sheet, cash flow. So you should know what's here. Oftentimes, the beginning cash balance will be at the top of these statements. I'll also stop here. So in the slide, I mentioned one method of calculating cash flow. There's 2 methods. The easier method is the method I showed on the slide, where you take net income, adjust for cash things, and it's operating income or operating cash flow. In a direct version, if you print your cash flow statement out of QuickBooks, what you're going to see is something more like this. You're going to see opening cash balance. You're going to see sales. You're going to see change in AR, total receipts. You're going to see disbursements, change in accounts payable, change in inventory to get to total disbursements. And then you're going to have a few other adjusting items. And so now you're going to see your beginning cash balance was 0, for instance. Your ending cash balance was 159. And you're able to go through and see where your business created and lost cash. And so depending on whether you're printing this out of a accounting system or creating this as part of a financial projection model, which we'll talk about in the following weeks, the look and feel of it may be different. Now, there's no good way to go through that many tabs in 8 minutes. So admittedly, I missed a lot of things, but I hope that you stay with us each week for the next 3 weeks and you'll get more understanding of these different things. I'm going to hop into questions at this time and try my best to answer a few before we wrap up at around 6 o'clock. So I'll hop into the chats. Excellent. Thank you guys for letting me know. I was the emperor with no clothes in terms of the model. I appreciate that. All right, so no questions in the chat, Q&A. Okay, I guess I must have explained everything. Well, let me do this. If folks don't have additional questions, I didn't think that would last too long. Run rate and leasing versus purchasing. Thank you, Justin. Run rate and leasing. Oh, I may need to get a little bit deeper level. Run rate and leasing versus purchasing and SaaS. Justin or Eric, I'm not exactly sure what you're saying. The plan is to give everyone access to this recording. So that is the plan. Here's what I'll say around run rate, leasing, purchasing, and SaaS, just in general, so I can try to answer this. And Eric, if you can pop in, or Justin, if you understand. Think about a car. You have 2 options. $10,000 car, you buy it. You go $10,000, swipe your card, bring in your duffel bag. You own the car, it's yours. You have no payment on it. You may also purchase the car and put $2,000 down and finance $8,000. Let me see if they... Oh, cool. Let me see if we can do that. Yes, if Justin can say it, that'd be even better than typing it. I may be a financial expert. I'm not yet a Zoom expert. Participants.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. And I hope I'm getting this right, Eric. So I think Eric's still here, but I can't see. So I think that the question, and I think you were headed down the right path, Elliott, which was when thinking about acquiring an asset, obtaining an asset, let me say it that way, how would one display or account for that in there? Because I think he asked that question around the time we were discussing burn, and how would you account for your run rate if you decided to lease an asset versus purchasing an asset? The SaaS part is a part that I'm a little lost on, but I think the first part of the question is still a good question to maybe dive in for a couple minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. So the easiest way to think about your burn rate is the cash out of the door in a period. So let's think about a month. If you purchase a car using $10,000 in January, in February, your burn rate associated with that car is zero. You already bought it. If you buy the car, but you put $2,000 down and finance $8,000, then your cash flow, saying your burn in January will be impacted by the $2,000 that you spent, but that won't be a normalized. So let's just talk about the normalized. The normalized will be the note payment that you pay every month on the $8,000 loan if you purchased it with some equity and some debt. If instead you leased it, as you guys know, if you go lease a car for 2 years versus buy it, the lease is a little bit less expensive on a per month basis, but you don't own a car at the end of the term. And so if you want to minimize burn in absolute basis with no consideration for anything else, a lease may be a better option. If you don't want to lose kind of the resale value of the asset, you may want to buy it just so you can resell it at the end of the period. But the way to think about burn is think about a 6-month or a 12-month or whatever the right period is that's long enough to be representative of the business, but short enough to be talking about the business in its current state, not 12 months ago. The average money going out of the door in any given month. So hopefully I answered that. If not, then I'm going to drop my email into the chat so everyone can email me. I'm more than willing to answer some questions after this. Let me go in here and see what else we may have. I'll do 1 or 2 more questions. I recommend monthly or quarterly, depending on how far along and how much money you have in your business, in terms of how often you recommend reconciling. I also would say a lot of companies have their CPAs do the reconciling. If you are a 2-person startup and you have a person selling and a person coding, I don't know if reconciling your financials is the best use of time. And I'll talk about that in a couple of weeks when I talk about quick hacks to get your financials in order for a venture capital meeting or a conversation with potential investors. And then, is there a general guide for evaluating if a service-based business is profitable or the percentage of profit that should be generated? Ray, this is an amazing question. So these are benchmarks. If you search benchmarks online, I'm not saying the first place you'll find will be perfect, but if you go to 5 different places, you'll be able to see, average SaaS profitability metrics per year of operation, per number of users, per a bunch of things. And you can look at that in any industry. There's some pretty good benchmarks out on the internet about what the profitability of these things should be, what the cost of goods sold should be versus the operating expenses, even what the salary as a percentage of revenue should be. So there's some pretty good benchmarks out there. I will also say you can look at, if you're doing a SaaS business and you're concerned about how the financials are looking, look at a public SaaS business that may have way more financials available, and you can sort of back into some of the benchmarks you should be considering. I'm looking at Eric McNeil. The SaaS is an additional option based on monthly consumption rate, or SaaS is very similar to leasing if you're paying out, Eric. So unless I understood a difference in between a SaaS and a lease, those models are essentially similar. Just like in a SaaS, you're using the software for a month for what you get charged in a month, and on the 31st day, you don't have any access. If you don't pay your lease, you don't have any access. I am going to answer, I think, one more question and wrap this up, and then hope that I can get some of these other questions in email form. I want to try to be cognizant of an hour because we're doing 4 of these. What do good financials look like for a startup? What do I consider good financials? Good qualifying question. And this will be the last one for this session. So good financials are kind of like good gumbo or good fried chicken. A lot of it depends on the eye of the beholder. And are you talking about chicken legs or thighs or breasts? And so I can't tell you what a good financial model looks like, because I think too often people overly exaggerate things where a reasonable investor would never believe it, and you wouldn't understand yet how quickly a seasoned investor can plow through BS in a financial model. Some are too conservative for an investor to really be concerned. So an investor is thinking about, how do I not only put money in your business, but how do I get it out? And if you're too conservative, I'm not going to understand how to get it out. And so I would say a good financial model looks like financial models in that industry. And so doing your research to understand what a SaaS business model should look like the one I'm showing here, or a rental financial model should look like, or an e-commerce model should look like. That's the way you should go about this. So I hope that everyone enjoyed this. I very much tried to speak at a level where everyone could understand. Clearly, there's no way to do that perfectly for 32 people, and no way to explain everything in finance in 34 minutes. But I would love for you guys to join us for next week's installment. I think Jules putting some information into the chat. I've put my email here in case you have other questions. And this session, like I said, is meant to help people along the way in some of these things that have been challenging for us for a long time. And so join us next Monday, where we'll go through cash flow and recognizing revenue. This is important to make good decisions about your runway, your burn rate, and how do you show revenue for a multi-year contract, which is something we've dealt with here recently with a portfolio company. And that'll be on October 11th, 5 p.m. Eastern. And wherever you saw us on Instagram or LinkedIn, you can get the registration link, or you may have been registered for all 4 when you first registered for this. But we are excited to see you, excited to have you. Thank you for attending, and see you next week.